So here we are, reading Conjure Wife, originally published in 1943, went public domain last year, and this is off of Project Gutenberg. You can get a copy over there. This is a horror story, so if you are sensitive to that sort of thing, that's as much of a content warning I can give you. It does deal with some things that are called witchcraft in the story, stuff like that, so, bear that in mind. It also uses language that I would not necessarily use in my day-to-day life, but I am going to read it because that's the way it was written. And yeah, without further ado, here's chapter 8. It was quite dark when they started for the hill. He drove carefully, taking his time at intersections. Tansy's gaiety still did no more than hold in check the other half of his thoughts. "I might be a witch," he said, "taking you to a hilltop rendezvous, or our own private sabbat." She was smiling impishly. She had changed to a light white sports dress. She looked like one of his students. Again, he felt the craziness of the situation. The line between reality and pretense was becoming harder to distinguish. He must keep carefully in mind that when she said things like that, she was making a courageous mockery of her previous behavior. He must on no account let her see the other half of his thoughts. Or was that what she wanted? The lights of the town dropped behind. Half a mile out, he turned off sharply onto the road that wound up the hill. It was bumpier than he remembered from the last time. Was it as much as 10 years ago? And the trees were thicker, brushing the windshield. When they emerged into the half-acre of clearing on the top, the moon, 2 days after full, was rising redly. Tansy pointed it out and said, "Check! I timed it perfectly. But where are the others? There always used to be 2 or 3 cars up here, and on a night like this." He stopped the car close to the edge. "Fashions in Lover's Lanes changed like anything else," he told her. We're traveling a disused folkway." Always the sociologist. "I guess so. Maybe Mrs. Carr found out about this place, and I suppose the students range farther afield nowadays, or did until this year." She rested her head on his shoulder. He switched off the headlights, and the moon cast soft shadows. "We used to do this at Gorham," she murmured, "when I was taking your classes and you were the serious young instructor, until I found out you weren't any different from the college boys, only better. Remember?" He nodded and took her hand. He looked down at the town, made out the campus with its prominent floodlights designed to chase couples out of dark corners. Those garishly floodlighted Gothic buildings seemed for the moment to symbolize a whole world of barren intellectual competition and jealous traditionalism. A world toward which, at the moment, he felt as alien as if he were still 26 instead of 41, and Tansy 21 instead of 36. "I wonder if that's why they hate us so," he said, almost without thinking. "Whatever are you talking about?" But the question sounded lazy. "I mean the rest of the faculty, or most of them. Is it because we can do things like this?" She laughed. "So you're actually coming alive. We don't do things like this so very often, you know." He kept on with his idea. "It's a devilishly competitive and jealous life. The war, doing away with some of it, makes you more conscious of the rest. And competition in an institution can be nastier than any other because it's so tight. Think so?" "I've lived with it for years," said Tansy simply. "Of course, it's all very petty, but petty emotions can come to outweigh big ones. Their size is better suited to the human mind." He looked down at Hempnell and tried to visualize the amount of ill will and jealousy he had inevitably accumulated for himself. He felt a slight chill creeping around. He realized where this train of thought was leading. The darker half of his mind loomed up ominously. "Here, philosopher," said Tansy, "have a slug." She was offering him a small silver flask. He recognized it. "I never dreamed you kept it all these years." "Uh-huh. Remember when I first offered you a drink from it? You were a trifle shocked, I believe, though you carried a flask too." "I took the drink." "Uh-huh. So take this one." It tasted like fire and spice. There were memories with it. Memories of those crazy prohibition years and of Gorham and New England. "Brandy?" "Greek style. Give me some." Before that flood of memories, the darker half of his mind receded. It was washed under. He looked at Tansy's sleek hair and moon-shadowed eyes. "Of course she's a witch," he thought lightly. "She's Lilith. Ishtar. He'd tell her so. You remember the time, he said, we slid down the bank to get away from the night watchman at Gorham? There would have been a magnificent scandal if he'd caught us. Oh yes, and the time. When they went down, the moon was an hour higher. He drove slowly. No need to imitate the sillier practices of the Prohibition era. A truck chugged past him. 2 more weeks. Rot. Who do you think he was, hearing voices? Joan of Arc? He felt hilarious. He wanted to tell Tansy all the ridiculous things he'd been imagining the last few days, so she could laugh at them too. It would make a swell ghost story. There was a reason he shouldn't tell her, but it was an insignificant reason. Part and parcel of this cramped, warped, overcautious Hempnell life they ought to break away from more often. So when they arrived in the living room, Tansy flopped down on the sofa. He began, You know, Tansy, about this witch stuff, I want to tell you. He was caught completely off guard by whatever force, subjective or objective, hit him. When it was over, he was sitting in the easy chair, completely sober, with the outer world once more an icy pressure on his senses, and the inner world a whirling sphere of alien thought, and the future a dark corridor 2 weeks long. It was as if a very large, horny hand had been clapped roughly over his mouth, and as if another such hand had grasped him by the shoulder, shook him, and slammed him down in the leather chair. As if? He looked around uneasily. Maybe there had been hands. Apparently Tansy had not noticed anything. Her face was a white oval in the gloom. She was still humming a snatch of song. She did not ask what he had started to say. He got up, walked unsteadily into the dining room, and poured himself a drink from the sideboard. On the way, he switched on the lights. So he couldn't tell Tansy or anyone else about it, even if he wanted to? That was why you never heard from real witchcraft victims, and why they never seemed able to escape, even if the means of escape were at hand? It wasn't weak will. They were watched. Like a gangster taken on a ride from an expensive nightclub. He must excuse himself from the loudmouth crowd at his table and laugh heartily and stop to chat with friends and throw a wink at the pretty girls, because right behind him are those white-scarfed, top-hatted trigger boys, hands in the pockets of their velvety dress overcoats. No use dying now. Better play along. There might be a chance. But that was storybook stuff, movie stuff. He nodded at himself in the glass above the sideboard. Meet Professor Saylor, he said, the distinguished ethnologist and firm believer in real witchcraft. But the face in the glass did not look so much disgusted as frightened. He mixed himself another drink and one for Tansy and took them into the living room. Here's to wickedness, said Tansy. Do you realize you haven't been anywhere near drunk since Christmas? He grinned. That was just what the movie gangster would do, to grab a moment of forgetfulness when the big boy had put him on the spot. And not a bad idea. Slowly, and at first only in a melancholy minor key, the mood of the hill returned. They talked, played old records, told jokes that were old enough to be new again. Tansy hammered the piano, and they sang a crazy assortment of songs, folk songs, hymns, national anthems, revolution songs, blues, Brahms, Schubert, haltingly at first, later at the top of their voices. They remembered, and they kept on drinking. But always, like a shimmering sphere of crystal, the alien's thoughts spun in his mind. The drink made it possible for him to regard them dispassionately, without constant revulsions in the name of common sense. He began to see worldwide evidence for the operation of witchcraft. For instance, was it not likely that all self-destructive impulses were the result of witchcraft, more or less efficiently screened off by protective magic, or not screened off at all? Those universal impulses that were a direct contradiction to the laws of self-preservation and survival. Poe has fancifully referred to an imp of the perverse, and psychoanalysts had laboriously hypothesized a death instinct to account for them. How much simpler to attribute them to malign forces outside the individual, working by means as yet unanalyzed and therefore classified as supernatural. His experiences during the past days could be divided into 2 distinct categories. The first included those natural misfortunes and antagonisms from which Tansy's magic had screened him. The attack on his life by Theodore Jennings should probably be placed in this category. The chances were that Jennings was actually psychopathic. He would not have made his murderous attack at an earlier date, had not Tansy's protective magic kept it from getting started. As soon as the screen was down, as soon as Norman burned the last hand, the idea that had suddenly burgeoned in Jennings's mind like a hothouse flower. Jennings had himself admitted it. I didn't realize until this minute. Margaret Van Nice's accusation, Thompson's sudden burst of interest in his extracurricular activities, and Sawtell's chance discovery of the Cunningham thesis also probably belonged in the same category. In the second category, active and malign witchcraft. A penny for your thoughts, offered Tansy, looking over the rim of her glass. I was thinking of that party last Christmas, he replied smoothly, and of how Welby crawled around playing a St. Bernard with the bearskin rug over his shoulders and the bottle of whiskey slung under his neck. He felt a childish pride in his cunning at having avoided being trapped into an admission. He simultaneously thought of Tansy as a genuine witch and as a potentially neurotic individual who had to be protected at all costs from dangerous suggestions. The liquor made his mind work by parts, and the parts had no check on each other. His consciousness began to black out for indeterminate intervals. Things began to happen by fits and starts. They were wailing St. James's Infirmary. He was thinking, why shouldn't the women be the witches? They are the intuitionalists, the traditionalists, the irrationalists, and like Tansy, most of them are never quite sure whether or not their witchcraft really works. They had shoved back the carpet and were dancing to Chloe. Sometime or other she had changed to her rose dressing gown. He was thinking, in the second category, put the Estrie Dragon, animated by a human or non-human soul, conjured into it by Mrs. Gunnison and controlled through photographs, inhibited by the protective screen so long as the protective screen existed. They had put on a record of Ravel's Bolero, and he was bleeding out the rhythm with his feet. Beating out the rhythm with his fist. He was thinking, all sculpture has a magical significance, from the Aurignacian Venus to Epstein's Genesis. The underlying intention has always been to produce a mannequin capable of being animated by sorcery. He was watching Tansy as she sang St. Louis blues in a hoarsely throbbing voice. It was true, just as Welby had also always maintained, that she had a genuine theatrical flair. Made a good chanteuse. He was thinking, Tansy stopped the Estrie Dragon with the knots, but she'll have a hard time doing anything like that again because Mrs. Gunnison has her book of formulas and can figure out ways to circumvent. They were sharing a highball that would have burned his throat if his throat had not been numb, and he seemed to be getting most of it. He was thinking, the tarot stick figure of the man in the truck is the key to a group of related sorceries. Cards began as instruments of magic, like sculpture. These sorceries aim at finishing me off. The bull roarer acts as an amplifier or reinforcement. The thing standing behind me with the flat voice and heavy hands is a guardian to see to it I do not deviate from the path appointed. Bull roaring and flat voice were associated in my dream. Narrow corridor, 2 weeks more. The strange thing was that these thoughts were not altogether unpleasant. They had a wild, black, poisonous beauty of their own, a lovely, deadly shimmer. They possessed the fascination of the impossible, the incredible. They hinted at unimaginable vistas. Even while they terrorized, they did not lose that chillingly poignant beauty. They were like the visions conjured up by some forbidden drug. They had the lure of an unknown sin and an ultimate blasphemy. He could understand the force that compelled the practitioners of black magic to take any risk. His drunkenness made him feel safe. It had broken his mind down into its ultimate particles, and those particles were incapable of fear because they could not be injured, just as the iron molecules of a battleship are quite safe from the bomb which blows the battleship apart. But now the particles were whirling crazily. Consciousness was wavering. They were in each other's arms. Tansy was asking eagerly, coaxingly, all that's mine is yours, all that's yours is mine? The question awakened a suspicion in his mind, but he could not grasp it clearly. Something made him think that the words held a trap. But what trap? His thoughts stumbled and reeled. She was saying, it sounded like the Bible, and I have drunk from your cup and eaten from your table. Her face was a blurred oval, her eyes like misty jewels. Everything you have is mine? You give it to me without hindrance and of your own free choice? Somewhere a trap. But the voice was irresistibly coaxing, like tickling fingers. All you have is mine? Just say it once, Norm. Just once. For me. Of course he loved her, better than anything else in the world. Yes, yes, everything, he heard himself saying. And then his mind toppled and plunged down into a fathomless ocean of darkness and silence and peace.